I had been looking forward to this trip for months. After the months of work and noise in the city, I craved silence and the kind of peace only the woods can give. The cabin was tucked away in a remote part of the forest, miles from any town or highway. I had found it online, an old rental place that promised solitude, a chance to disconnect from everything. The pictures looked perfect. A small wooden cabin beside a quiet lake, surrounded by tall pine trees that swayed softly in the wind. No neighbors for miles, no cell service. Just the kind of place I needed. I drove the long gravel road leading up to the cabin just as the sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. The car tires crunched on the loose gravel as I pulled up to the small clearing where the cabin stood. It was smaller than I imagined but sturdy, made of dark logs weathered by time. The porch was narrow, with a couple of wooden chairs that looked like they hadn't been used in a while. I grabbed my bags, the air crisp and smelling of pine and earth, and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like old wood and faintly of must. It had a simple layout: a small kitchen with a wood stove, a table by the window, a couch, and a single bedroom with a worn-out mattress. There was a small bathroom with a shower, but no running water beyond that. The water came from a well outside. I had brought bottled water, canned food, and a good supply of firewood. I wasn't sure if the stove worked well, but it seemed functional enough. I unpacked slowly, enjoying the quiet. No phones ringing, no cars passing by, no city noise, just the sounds of the forest. The soft rustling of the pine needles, the occasional bird call, the distant splash of water from the lake. I decided to start a fire. The wood was dry and crackled as I lit it. The warm glow filled the room and made the place feel more like home. Night settled quickly, and the darkness outside the windows was thick and total. Without streetlights or city glow, the stars shone with an almost painful brightness. I sat on the porch for a while, wrapped in a blanket, staring up at the sky. The silence was peaceful, almost comforting. I felt a strange kind of happiness, like the world was still here, waiting, undisturbed by all the noise and chaos. Inside, the cabin creaked as the wind picked up. The pine trees swayed harder, their needles brushing against the roof. I felt the weight of isolation settle around me, but it didn't bother me. I was used to being alone. I went to bed early, the fire dying down to glowing embers. The bed was firm and smelled faintly of cedar. Outside, the wind whistled softly through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped. I closed my eyes and let the forest sounds lull me to sleep. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. There was a noise, something different this time. Not the usual creaks or wind or animals. It was a soft, repetitive thud coming from outside. At first, I thought it might be a branch falling or some animal, but the sound was too regular. Thud, 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 like something heavy hitting the ground at regular intervals. My heart beat faster. I stayed still, listening. The thuds came again, slow and steady. Then silence. A few seconds passed. Then thud, thud, thud again. I didn't want to open the door and see what it was, but curiosity gnawed at me. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and slowly stepped outside onto the porch. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the ground around the cabin. The forest was silent, the trees standing still against the night sky. I moved the light toward the lake, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was making the noise. The shore was empty, no sign of anything unusual. No animals, no fallen branches, nothing. I scanned the area more carefully. Near the edge of the trees, I noticed something on the ground. It looked like footprints, large, heavy prints pressed into the soft soil. They were fresh. The earth hadn't dried or blown over them. The prints led from the edge of the forest toward the cabin, then stopped at the porch. I felt a cold wave of unease. I knew I wasn't alone here. Something had come close to the cabin during the night. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat by the dying fire. I checked the windows, making sure they were shut tight. The thudding noise didn't come back, but the unease lingered. I kept the flashlight close, ready for anything. Morning came slowly. The sun pushed through the pine needles, casting long shafts of light across the floor. The forest looked peaceful again, as if nothing had happened. I stepped outside to inspect the prints in the daylight. They were unmistakably human. Large boots, heavy tread, made by someone wearing sturdy shoes. The prints continued from the porch, back into the woods. I followed them cautiously for a while. They led deeper into the forest, but then stopped abruptly by a fallen tree. I crouched down and looked around. There were signs someone had been camping here recently. A small fire pit made of rocks, some scraps of torn fabric caught on a branch, and a few empty cans scattered nearby. Whoever had been here didn't stay long. I felt a strange mix of fear and relief. Fear because someone had been this close without me knowing. Relief because they had left. The thought of someone lurking nearby unsettled me. I decided to spend the day exploring the area, trying to get my mind off the prints. The forest was dense but beautiful. The lake was calm, its surface smooth like glass. I walked along the shore, feeling the cool water on my fingers. The forest was alive with small sounds. Birds calling, insects buzzing, the wind rustling through leaves. Despite the beauty, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I stopped moving, every time I looked around, I thought I saw shadows between the trees or heard a twig snap in the distance. But every time I turned, there was nothing. Back at the cabin, I tried to make it feel safer. I stacked wood by the door, checked the locks, and made sure my phone was charged, though I knew there was no signal. I found an old hunting knife in a drawer and put it on the table, just in case. I hated feeling vulnerable. That night, I stayed awake longer, sitting by the fire with the knife close. The thudding noise did not return, but the quiet was almost too much. I thought about leaving, about packing up and driving back to the city where things were loud but predictable. But I stayed. The next day, I tried to relax. I went fishing on the lake. I hadn't brought a fishing pole, but I found some old gear in the cabin's shed. It was rusty but usable. I caught a small fish and cooked it over the fire, the smell filling the cabin with a comforting warmth. As the day went on, I began to feel a little more at ease. The woods were just woods, nothing more. The prints could have been hikers passing through. The noises just animals or the wind. But late in the afternoon, I noticed something strange. Near the edge of the lake, close to the cabin's dock, there were more footprints. Smaller, lighter prints, like from someone moving quietly. They led toward the trees and stopped suddenly. I examined them closely. They were fresh, too fresh. A chill ran down my spine. I checked the cabin again, making sure every door and window was secure. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared. I knew someone had been close again, maybe watching, waiting. I spent the evening double-checking everything. I piled more wood in front of the door, moved a chair against the window, anything to feel safer. I stayed awake until the fire died out, my eyes darting to every shadow. That night, I heard something at the door, a soft scraping noise, like nails or something rough dragged along the wood. My heart thumped so loud I was sure it could be heard outside. I held my breath, waiting. Nothing else came. The next morning, I woke early and walked around the cabin to see if there were any signs of intruders. Near the back door, I found scratch marks on the wood. Fresh, deep lines like someone had tried to force it open but stopped. I decided then that I couldn't stay any longer. I packed my things quickly, feeling both disappointment and relief. I wanted to be alone, but not this alone. As I locked the cabin door behind me, I took one last look around. The forest was still, the lake calm. The sun rose higher, shining through the trees. I started down the gravel road, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. I didn't look back. When I reached the main road hours later, I saw my phone had 1 bar of signal. I called a friend, telling them I was safe and on my way home. The trip wasn't what I expected. The cabin was beautiful, the forest peaceful, but I learned that being alone out there meant facing something else. Fear of the unknown, the feeling that you're not as alone as you think. The footprints, the noises, the marks on the door, real things, human things, not ghosts or stories. Just people or maybe one person close enough to scare me. But the forest stayed quiet after that, and so did the cabin. I never went back, but I don't regret going. Sometimes, Peace isn't just silence. There's no The weekend started off like any other. I was craving a break from the noise of the city, the constant hum of traffic, the buzz of people everywhere, the never-ending grind of work. I wanted to get away from it all, somewhere quiet, somewhere with no distractions. A cabin in the woods seemed perfect. I found a small place online, tucked away in a national forest several hours from the city. It was old but sturdy, with a fireplace, running water, and no cell service. Exactly what I wanted. I packed my car the night before, simple stuff. A few clothes, some food, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, a book, and some bottled water. No phone charger, knowing I wouldn't have service. The drive was long but peaceful, the roads winding through dense trees and hills. As I got closer, the sunlight dimmed under the thick canopy of pines. The air felt fresher, cooler. The cabin was smaller than I expected. It sat alone on a small clearing surrounded by tall trees on all sides. The paint was peeling, and the wooden porch creaked under my steps. Inside, the smell of old wood mixed with a faint mustiness. Dust lay thick on surfaces, and the furniture was worn, but clean enough. There was a small kitchen with a rusty stove, a table, a couple of chairs, and a sofa that looked like it had seen better days. The bedroom was a simple loft with a thin mattress on the floor. The bathroom was just a small room with a sink and a composting toilet. I spent the first afternoon unpacking and settling in. I stacked some firewood near the fireplace and started a fire to chase the chill out of the cabin. The flames flickered warmly, casting shadows on the walls. Outside, birds sang, and a gentle wind rustled through the leaves. I opened the window to let the fresh forest air in. It was quiet except for the natural sounds of the woods, which was oddly comforting. As evening fell, the sky turned dark blue, then black. I cooked a simple dinner over the stove, canned beans and rice. The silence was complete. No cars, no voices, just the crackle of the fire and the occasional snap of a twig outside. I sat on the porch for a while, staring at the dark trees. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I reminded myself this was why I came here, away from the chaos. I went to bed early, tired from the drive. The mattress was thin and hard, but I was exhausted, so I fell asleep quickly. That night, I woke several times, not from noise, but from the feeling of being watched. It wasn't anything I could prove, just a sense, a prickling at the back of my neck. The wind whispered outside, and the trees groaned as they swayed. I told myself it was nothing but my imagination playing tricks in the dark. The next morning, I woke to sunlight filtering through the small window. I made coffee on the stove and sat at the table, looking out at the forest. I had no plans for the day other than hiking nearby trails and enjoying the solitude. I grabbed my backpack with water, some snacks, and my map, and headed out. The trail was narrow and rough, winding through thick undergrowth and towering trees. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. I walked slowly, enjoying the quiet, the feeling of being surrounded by nature. Birds fluttered in the branches, and every so often, a squirrel darted across the path. The forest was alive, but still very calm. After about an hour, I reached a small clearing with a creek running through it. The water was clear and cold, tumbling over smooth stones. I sat on a rock by the bank and ate a sandwich while watching the water. I felt relaxed, at ease. No distractions, no one around. Then I noticed something odd. On the other side of the creek, near a group of bushes, there was a small pile of rocks arranged in a neat stack. It looked deliberate, like someone had built it as a marker or a sign. I thought it was strange, but didn't think much of it. Maybe someone else had been hiking here recently. I packed up and headed back toward the cabin. The sun was higher now, making dappled patterns on the trail. As I walked, I started to notice more of those rock piles, scattered here and there along the path. Some were small, just 3 or 4 stones balanced on top of each other. Others were bigger, 10 or more stones stacked carefully. It was strange to see so many, but I assumed they were trail markers left by other hikers. When I returned to the cabin, I felt tired but content. I made another fire and sat by it, reading my book. The sky outside began to darken again. The woods seemed quieter now, the birds gone, replaced by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Later that night, I started to feel uneasy again. The sense of being watched was stronger now. I kept glancing out the window at the black shapes of trees, half expecting to see movement. The fire burned low, and I was too restless to sleep. Around midnight, I heard a noise outside, a soft thud followed by a scraping sound. It was too light to be an animal and too close to be the wind. I stayed very still, listening. The scraping continued, slow and deliberate, moving along the side of the cabin. My heart pounded. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly walked to the door. Outside, the air was cold and still. I swept the light around the perimeter of the cabin. The beam caught the trees and the dark underbrush, but nothing moved. Then I spotted another rock pile, right by the corner of the porch. This one was different. It was bigger, about 2 feet tall, and looked freshly stacked. The stones were clean, no dirt or moss, like someone had placed them very recently. I shone the flashlight into the woods beyond the clearing. The beam revealed nothing but dark shadows and tall trunks. I felt a chill run down my spine. Someone had to be here nearby. I went back inside and locked the door, though I knew it was just a flimsy wooden door with a simple latch. I checked all the windows and closed the curtains. The cabin felt smaller, more like a trap than a refuge. The silence pressed in on me. I sat by the fire, my flashlight beside me, and tried to calm down. I thought about calling for help, but I had no signal. I thought about leaving immediately, but it was dark and I didn't want to get lost in the forest at night. Then I heard it again, the scraping noise, this time from the back of the cabin. I held my breath and waited. After a few seconds, the sound stopped. Nothing else happened. I stayed awake the rest of the night, every muscle tense, eyes fixed on the door and windows. When dawn finally came, I felt drained but relieved. The light made the cabin feel safer. During the day, I searched around the clearing, looking for footprints or any signs of someone. I found nothing except the rock piles, which seemed to have multiplied overnight. There were some faint tracks near the creek, but they were too old to tell much. I kept a small knife in my pocket just in case and stayed close to the cabin. That afternoon, I decided to pack up and leave. The sense of danger was too strong, and I wasn't going to stay another night feeling like a prisoner. I loaded my things, made sure the fire was out, and locked the cabin one last time. As I walked to my car, I looked back at the cabin. The piles of rocks were still there, silent and cold. The drive back was tense. Every shadow along the road made me glance nervously in the rearview mirror. I kept thinking about those rock piles, about how deliberate they were, about how someone had to be watching me all that time. The forest didn't feel peaceful anymore. When I finally got back to the city, I felt like I had escaped from something real and dangerous. I told myself it was probably some local prank, maybe hunters or hikers trying to scare visitors. But deep down, I knew that the feeling of being watched in that silent, dark forest was something I would never forget. The cabin had been a place to find peace, but it had turned into a trap of fear. I realized that sometimes the scariest things are not ghosts or monsters, but the very real presence of someone watching in the dark, waiting for the right moment. I never went back to that cabin. I don't even want to know who left those rock piles or what they meant, but the memory stays with me. A reminder that some places hold more than just silence. And some nights, when the wind rustles just right, I still feel that cold prickling on the back of my neck, as if those eyes are still watching. I've always liked the quiet of the woods, the way the trees sway with the wind, the crackle of dead leaves underfoot, the smell of damp earth mixed with pine. It's a feeling of being away from the world, away from noise and people. That's why I decided to spend a weekend alone in that old cabin I found listed online, tucked deep in the forests of northern Minnesota. It wasn't fancy, no electricity, no running water, but it was a chance to get away, to clear my head. The drive out was long, winding through narrow roads flanked by thick woods that looked like they hadn't changed in 100 years. The air smelled fresh, cool, and piney. I had a small backpack with some food, water, a lantern, a flashlight, matches, and a basic first aid kit. I didn't expect to need much more. The cabin's description had said it was off the grid, but the stove worked, and there was a small well nearby. When I finally pulled off the road onto a rough dirt path, the car bounced and rattled. The sun was beginning to lower, turning the sky a deep orange. I parked next to a small clearing, the cabin barely visible through the trees. It was old, made of rough logs stacked thickly with chinking in between. The roof sagged a bit in places, but it looked solid enough. The front porch had a wooden bench and a rusty metal chair. I grabbed my gear and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like dry wood, dust, and something earthy, maybe a hint of mildew from sitting empty. It was darker inside than I expected, the windows small and covered with thick grime. I set down my backpack and lit the lantern. The soft glow flickered against the wooden walls. There was a small kitchen area with a wood stove, a sink with a hand pump, and a rough wooden table. A narrow staircase led to a loft with a mattress on the floor. I unpacked my supplies and prepared some dinner, a simple pasta dish heated on the stove. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, a steady, low moan that seemed to fill the silence. The cabin felt peaceful, but there was something in the quiet that made my skin crawl just a little. The kind of quiet that isn't empty, but full of waiting. After eating, I washed my dishes in the sink using water pumped from the well. The water was cold and fresh. I filled a bottle and set it on the table. As the sun disappeared completely, I closed the curtains to keep out the night shadows. I lit a few candles and sat near the stove to stay warm. The flames flickered and cast tall shadows that danced on the walls. I pulled out a notebook I'd brought along and started writing about the trip, trying to focus on the simple things. The smell of the trees, the way the wind sounded, the feel of the wooden floor beneath my feet. But the wind outside kept picking up, rattling the windows, making the cabin creak and groan. At one point, I thought I heard a branch scrape the roof, sharp and sudden. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just the wind, the trees settling, animals moving outside. Still, a strange unease settled in my chest, like something was watching just beyond the edge of the clearing. I stood up and walked to the window, peering into the dark woods. I couldn't see anything, just endless black shapes of trees and shadows. The night stretched on slowly. I stayed awake longer than I'd planned, listening to the noises outside. The occasional snap of twigs, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, and that persistent wind that never seemed to let up. At one point, a sharp, heavy thud came from the side of the cabin. I froze, heart pounding, scanning the dark. I imagined a fallen branch, but the sound felt deliberate, solid. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside, stepping carefully onto the rough wooden porch. The cold air hit me sharply. I swept the beam over the ground and trees. The underbrush was thick, shadows deep. Nothing moved. The ground was covered with dead leaves and broken branches. I circled the cabin slowly, flashlight cutting through the dark. That's when I noticed the footprints in the dirt near the side of the cabin. Large, heavy prints, not like an animal's. They looked fresh, pressed deep into the soft earth. I hadn't seen anyone else around all day, and the closest road was miles away. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe a hunter or a hiker had passed through, but why hadn't I seen them? Why hadn't they made any noise? The air felt colder suddenly, sharper. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me and sliding a wooden bar into place. I sat down with the lantern close, the light flickering nervously. I kept checking the windows, watching for any movement in the dark. The night felt endless. Every creak, every crack of wood made me jump. I tried to stay calm, telling myself the prints were old, maybe from earlier that day. But deep down, I knew someone had been there recently, close enough to leave marks. As dawn began to creep through the grimy windows, the noises outside slowed. The wind calmed. Light spilled into the cabin, painting the walls a soft orange. I felt a little relief, but the unease hadn't fully left. I packed my things quickly, determined to leave as soon as the sun was fully up. Before I went, I stepped outside again to look around in the daylight. The footprints were still there, clear and deep in the soil, leading off into the woods. I traced them with my eyes, wondering how far they went. I noticed something else: scattered scraps of cloth and small pieces of a broken backpack near the edge of the clearing. Whoever had been there had left in a hurry, or something had gone wrong. The thought tightened my stomach. I looked deeper into the trees but saw no sign of anyone or anything else. I got back in my car, doors locked, and started the engine. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the dark forest behind me. The cabin shrank into the distance, swallowed up by the trees. That weekend stayed with me for weeks afterward. The quiet, the footprints, the feeling of being watched. It was the kind of fear that doesn't come from ghosts or monsters, but from real things. The unknown people, the isolation, the wilderness itself. There was no storybook ending, no sudden rescue or clear explanation, but I didn't need one. I knew I had been close to something dangerous, something human and real. In the end, I realized that sometimes the scariest stories aren't the ones you tell. They're the ones you carry with you. The ones you feel in your gut when you're alone in the dark, surrounded by silence and shadows that don't belong to any fairy tale. The wind had been blowing all day, making the tall pine trees sway and creak against the fading sunlight. I had driven for hours along the narrow, winding road deep into the mountains, away from the noise of the city and the small towns I had passed through. The cabin was supposed to be a place where I could be alone for a few days, to clear my mind and forget the constant buzz of screens and people. The idea was simple: no distractions, just me, the woods, and the silence. I was ready for that silence. I wanted it. The cabin itself was not fancy, just a small wooden structure with a porch that wrapped around two sides. The wood was weathered, the paint peeling in spots, but it had a sturdy look to it. The windows were dusty, but I could tell the inside was clean from the soft glow of the old lamp hanging near the front door. I parked my car on the gravel driveway, stepping out into the crisp air that smelled of pine and earth. It was early evening, and the sky was a deep blue streaked with fading pink clouds. I carried my bags inside, feeling the floorboards creak under my boots. The air inside was cool but not cold, smelling faintly of wood smoke and something sweet. Maybe pine needles that had found their way inside over the years. The cabin was simple: a small kitchen with a worn table and 4 chairs, a living room with a faded sofa, and a wood stove in the corner. Upstairs, there was a single bedroom with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the trees. I unpacked slowly, placing my things carefully on the table and the bed. I didn't want to disturb the quiet, but I wanted to make the place feel like mine. I had brought some canned food, a few fresh fruits, and a big thermos of coffee. There was a stack of firewood next to the stove and a box of matches on the kitchen counter. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, I lit a fire in the stove. The crackling flames gave off a soft orange glow that pushed back the shadows in the room. The warmth spread quickly, making the cabin feel cozy and safe. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows and causing the trees to groan. I sat on the sofa, wrapped in a thick blanket, and watched the fire. The only sounds were the fire, the wind, and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. Night came fast in the mountains, and soon the cabin was swallowed by darkness. I felt a small knot of nervousness tighten in my chest, but I told myself it was just the unfamiliar sounds. I wasn't used to being so isolated. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the phone had no signal. This was exactly what I had wanted: complete solitude. As I got ready for bed, I noticed the full moon shining through the window. It was bright and clear, casting long shadows on the floor. I closed the curtains but left a crack open to let some of the moonlight in. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I climbed the narrow stairs slowly, the wood creaking beneath my weight. The bedroom was small but comfortable, with a thick quilt folded at the foot of the bed. I lay down and stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind and the occasional snap of a twig outside. After a while, my eyelids grew heavy, and I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night, a strange sound pulling me from the edges of sleep. It was faint, almost a whisper, but it was definitely there. A soft scratching noise, like nails dragging over wood, coming from somewhere outside. My heart started to race as I sat up, listening. The wind had died down, and now the forest was eerily still except for that faint scratching. It was coming from near the porch. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer rubbing against the wood. But the sound was irregular, deliberate almost, and it didn't stop. I pulled on my boots and grabbed the flashlight I had left on the nightstand. My hands shook slightly as I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The cold night air hit me immediately. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the wooden railing and the steps leading down to the ground. The scratching noise stopped the moment I stepped outside. I scanned the area carefully, shining the light on the trees, the bushes, and the ground. There was nothing there, just the dense forest looming silently. I called out softly, hoping the sound of my voice would scare off whatever was making the noise, but the forest swallowed it quickly. Nothing answered. I stood there for a few minutes, feeling exposed and alone. The moon was still bright, but it did little to ease the weight of the dark woods around me. When nothing else happened, I closed the door and locked it behind me. Back inside, I made sure all the windows were shut tight and checked the locks on the doors. I felt safer with the wooden walls between me and the outside, but the feeling didn't last long. I tried to sleep again, but my mind was restless. Every small noise, branches tapping the window, the house settling, the creak of the old floorboards, made me jump. The wind started up again, howling softly like a distant animal call. But this time it felt different, more urgent. Hours later, I woke once more, this time because of a louder noise. It was a heavy thud against the cabin wall, then another, like something was hitting the wood with force. I froze, listening. The sound repeated 3 times, slow and deliberate. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it would echo in the room. I wanted to tell myself it was just a falling branch or some animal, but the timing felt too calculated. I grabbed the flashlight and edged toward the door. Peeking through the window, I shone the light outside. The yard was empty except for scattered leaves and small branches. Nothing moved. I stepped onto the porch again, shining the light around, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever had made the noise. I saw nothing but the shadows of trees and the dim light of the moon. The forest was silent again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My skin prickled, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead despite the chill in the air. The next morning, the sun rose slowly, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold. The quiet comfort of daylight eased my nerves a bit. I made a fire in the stove and brewed coffee, the familiar smell helping me feel more grounded. Outside, the forest looked peaceful and inviting. Birds sang from the trees, and the fresh air was clean and sharp. I decided to explore the area around the cabin to calm my nerves. The forest was dense but walkable, with tall trees casting long shadows on the forest floor. The ground was soft with fallen leaves and pine needles, and small animals darted through the underbrush. As I walked, I noticed signs of wildlife, tracks in the mud, broken branches, and bird nests high in the trees. The forest was alive and full of quiet motion, but there was nothing threatening about it during the daylight. I found a small stream a short distance from the cabin. The water was clear and cold, trickling over smooth stones. I sat on a rock and rested, listening to the gentle rush of water and the distant calls of birds. It felt good to be outside, to breathe the fresh air and soak in the sun. When I returned to the cabin, I spent the afternoon fixing small things that needed attention. Tightening loose nails on the porch, sweeping the floor, and stacking more firewood. The work kept my mind busy and helped push away the uneasy feelings from the night before. As the evening fell, I made dinner and sat by the fire, reading a book I had brought. The cabin felt warm and safe in the firelight, but I kept the door locked and the windows shut tight. That night, I slept better. The noises from the forest didn't wake me, and the wind was calm. I woke naturally with the first light and felt refreshed. The next few days passed much the same way. I explored the forest trails during the day, collecting firewood and cooking simple meals in the cabin. I felt the tension in my body ease, replaced by a quiet appreciation for the solitude and beauty around me. But the forest held its own rhythms and rules, and I learned to respect them. I never stayed out after dark and always kept a careful eye on the weather and my surroundings. The woods were not dangerous in a fairy tale sense, but they were unpredictable and indifferent. On the final morning, I packed my bags slowly, savoring the last moments of silence before the return to the busy world. I took one last walk through the woods, noticing how the light filtered through the branches and how the air smelled fresh and alive. Back at the cabin, I opened the windows to air out the space, feeling grateful for the time I had spent there. The quiet had helped me find a kind of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. Driving away, I looked back at the cabin nestled among the trees. It was just a simple building, but it had given me something important, a chance to face the unknown, to be alone without fear, and to find calm in the wild. The woods would keep their secrets, but I had left with a clear mind and a steady heart, ready for whatever came next. The late afternoon light was soft and golden when I first pulled up to the cabin. It stood alone at the edge of the woods, an old structure that looked as if it had been built decades ago. The wooden walls were weathered, paint peeling, but the place seemed solid, with a steep roof that had seen better days. I had rented it for a weekend away from the city, wanting nothing more than to disconnect from everything. No phone, no internet, just the woods and me. The road up was rough and narrow, twisting through thick trees and patches of wild grass, making the trip feel like stepping back in time. I parked the car on a small clearing and got out, the fresh air filling my lungs with a cold crispness I had been missing for months. The cabin door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside was dim but cozy, smelling of old wood and a faint hint of smoke from the chimney. A small stone fireplace sat on one side of the room, with logs stacked beside it, and a few pieces of basic furniture. An old table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed in the corner. A dusty rug covered part of the wooden floor. There was no electricity except for a single hanging lantern, and I had brought a few candles just in case. The windows were small and framed by heavy curtains that looked like they hadn't been washed in years. Outside, the trees pressed in close, their branches swaying softly in the breeze. It was quiet in a way I wasn't used to. No cars, no planes, just the distant rustle of leaves and the occasional bird call. After setting down my bag, I explored a bit. The cabin was simple, with a tiny kitchen area that had a cast iron stove, a sink with a hand pump, and a cupboard with a few canned goods left behind by the last renters. I hadn't come here to cook elaborate meals. Mostly, I planned on making coffee in the morning and some simple sandwiches. Outside, I noticed an old fire pit with charred stones, surrounded by a circle of large rocks. Someone had been here before me, though not recently, judging by the overgrown grass. A narrow path led into the forest, worn but still visible, disappearing into the shadows of tall pines and oaks. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I lit the fire in the fireplace. The flames crackled, sending sparks upward, and the warmth quickly filled the small room. Shadows danced along the walls, and the wooden beams overhead seemed to stretch higher than they looked in daylight. I sat by the fire with a book I'd brought, but my mind wasn't focused on the words. There was a heaviness in the air, a quiet tension I couldn't explain. The silence outside the cabin was so complete it almost pressed in on me, making the small sounds, like the wind rubbing through the trees or a twig snapping underfoot, feel magnified. Night came slowly, darker than I expected without the city lights to dull it. When I stepped outside, the stars blazed in the sky like scattered diamonds. The air was colder now, sharp against my skin, and the forest felt different under the moonlight. The trees loomed tall and still, their shadows long and black. I walked to the edge of the clearing, the grass cold and wet beneath my feet, listening to the night sounds, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. There was no wind now, just a stillness that wrapped around me like a thick blanket. Back inside, I made sure the fire was good and steady, then settled down to sleep on the bed. The mattress was thin and lumpy, but warm beneath the thick wool blanket I'd brought. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters and sending the curtains fluttering. The noise was strangely comforting at first, but as the hours passed, it became unsettling. Every creak of the cabin, every distant snap of a branch made me startle awake. I found myself listening for something I couldn't name, eyes wide in the dark room. Around midnight, the sounds outside grew louder. At first, it was just the wind and the shifting trees, but then came something else. Footsteps, slow and heavy, moving just beyond the clearing. I held my breath and strained to listen. The footsteps stopped. Then came a faint scrape, like someone dragging something along the ground. My heart pounded, and I told myself it was probably just an animal, a deer or a bear perhaps. But the sounds were too deliberate, too measured to be random. I reached for my phone to check the time and battery, but there was no signal. I realized I was completely cut off. The night stretched on, and I stayed awake, too anxious to sleep. I heard the footsteps again, this time moving around the side of the cabin, slow and steady. I imagined a figure cloaked in dark clothes, moving cautiously through the brush. My mind raced, thinking of the worst possibilities. Was someone watching me? Had they followed me here? The thought sent chills down my spine. Morning came with a pale light filtering through the curtains. The sounds of the forest returned to normal. Birds chirping, a breeze rustling leaves. I got up and checked around the cabin. Nothing was out of place, no footprints near the door, no signs of forced entry. I tried to shake off the fear, telling myself I must have imagined the noises. Maybe the wind had shifted debris, or a large animal had moved nearby. I decided to stay for the day, but kept the fire going for comfort and light. I spent the day exploring the nearby woods, keeping the cabin in sight most of the time. The forest was dense and tangled, with thick underbrush and fallen logs. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. I found an old trail marked by broken branches and footprints that didn't look quite right. Too big, and with a strange pattern. I followed it a short way, but the feeling of being watched made me turn back. There was no one in sight, but the quiet tension lingered. That evening, I prepared a simple meal on the stove, the warm light from the fire casting long shadows. As darkness fell, I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows. Outside, the footsteps returned, this time closer and more frequent. I heard the crunch of gravel near the fire pit and the scraping of a metal object. I didn't dare open the door, but grabbed a heavy branch I'd brought for protection. The noises went on for hours, then stopped suddenly around 2 in the morning. I stayed awake until dawn, heart hammering, waiting for any sign of movement. When the first light appeared, I packed quickly and left, not looking back until I reached the main road. On the drive home, I called the rental agency and told them about the noises and how uneasy I felt. They apologized and said no one else had reported anything strange before, but that the area had seen some recent reports of trespassers and illegal campers. I never went back to that cabin. The silence of the woods that should have been peaceful had turned into something else entirely, something I didn't want to face again. But that weekend taught me something important. Nature, for all its beauty, can be unpredictable and raw, and sometimes the scariest things aren't from stories or myths, but from the very real unknown lurking in the shadows just beyond the light. It was early autumn when I decided to spend a few days alone at a small cabin deep in the woods. I had rented the cabin from a family friend who owned it but never stayed there much. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city, away from people, phones, and everything that felt too crowded. The plan was simple. Pack a few things, drive out late Friday afternoon, spend 3 nights in the cabin, and come back refreshed. I didn't want to bring too much, just what I needed to survive and some food. No distractions, just me and the woods. The drive was long. The roads got narrower and rougher the farther I went. At some point, the paved road turned into gravel, then dirt. Trees pressed close to the road on both sides, their leaves already turning yellow and red, shaking lightly in the cool breeze. The sun was starting to drop when I finally reached the small clearing where the cabin sat. It wasn't big or fancy. A simple wooden structure with a stone chimney and a porch with 2 old rocking chairs. Smoke curled up from the chimney. Someone had been there recently, I thought, but I didn't see any cars or signs of life around. I stepped out of my car, the crunch of gravel under my boots loud in the quiet air. The forest around me smelled of pine, wet earth, and leaves. The silence was heavy, but not empty. I felt watched, maybe by birds or small animals hidden in the trees. I carried my backpack and a small cooler to the porch, then unlocked the cabin door. The inside smelled of wood and something faintly musty, like the cabin hadn't been aired out in a while. The floor creaked under my weight. There was a small kitchen with an old stove, a wooden table with a couple of chairs, and a bed pushed against the far wall. The windows were small and grimy, letting in the fading light. I dropped my things and sat for a moment, feeling the calm settle in. I made a fire in the stone fireplace. The wood was dry and cracked, and after a few tries, flames caught and warmed the room. The fire's orange light flickered against the wooden walls, and I felt a small comfort from the cold outside. I pulled out a simple dinner I'd packed, some bread, cheese, and a few canned beans. I ate slowly, listening to the snap and pop of the fire. Outside, the forest was darkening quickly. I got ready for bed early, feeling the exhaustion from the drive creep in. I stacked some wood by the fireplace, poured water from the tap into a pot, and set it to boil in case I wanted tea in the morning. I brushed my teeth, changed into warm clothes, and crawled under the thin blanket on the bed. The night was quiet except for the occasional creak of the cabin settling and distant sounds of animals moving. I didn't hear any wind or storms forecasted, so I felt safe. Around midnight, I woke to a noise outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling the leaves, but the sound was different, softer, heavier, slower. Something was moving near the cabin. My heart started pounding, and I sat up slowly, trying to listen better. There was a low crunching noise, like someone stepping carefully on dry twigs. The porch light was out, and the windows only showed blackness. I reached for my phone, but the screen showed no signal. I had expected that. There was no cell service this far in. The noise stopped for a moment, then started again, coming closer. I grabbed the flashlight I had brought and shone it out the window. The beam caught nothing but thick darkness and swaying branches. I didn't see any animals or people. I stayed very still, holding the flashlight out the window, watching the edge of the clearing. My breath was shallow. The crunching stopped abruptly. A shadow moved just at the edge of the light, something big, but I couldn't tell what. Then it was gone. I waited for a long time, heart racing, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I turned off the flashlight, lay back down, and tried to calm my thoughts. It was probably just a deer or some other animal passing through. I told myself. The forest was full of life. I had no proof anything dangerous was out there. Still, sleep didn't come easy. Morning brought a thin gray light through the grimy windows. I was cold and tired, but the sun was up, and the world outside looked peaceful again. I got up, stretched, and started a fire in the fireplace. I made tea with the boiling water and ate some dry cereal I'd packed. I looked out the window and saw tracks in the dirt just outside the porch. They were big, much bigger than my boots. The prints were clear in the soft earth, and they led off into the woods, away from the cabin. I studied them closely. They looked like animal tracks, maybe a bear or a large dog. The prints showed heavy claws and a wide pad. My first thought was to be careful, but the tracks didn't look fresh. I couldn't tell how old they were, but the leaves and twigs in the prints hadn't been disturbed much. Still, I made a mental note to be cautious, especially at night. The day passed slowly. I explored the small clearing, walking carefully through the trees, marking the path back so I wouldn't get lost. The woods were thick, full of tall pines and oaks, their leaves just starting to fall. The ground was soft with moss and fallen leaves. Birds called to each other high in the branches. I found a small stream about a quarter mile from the cabin, its water clear and cold. I filled my water bottle there, feeling good about having fresh water close by. Back at the cabin, I gathered more firewood. I noticed some old cans and trash near a small pile of rocks not far from the clearing. signs that someone had been camping nearby at some point. The place felt lived in, but not recently. The quiet made me uneasy at times. I kept thinking I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows that didn't belong. But every time I looked, there was nothing. That night was worse than the first. The sounds outside came back, louder this time. Branches cracked, heavy breathing echoed faintly in the dark, and the crunching on the gravel porch returned. I stayed inside, flashlight ready, watching the windows. I could hear the wind picking up, carrying a sharp cold that slipped through the cracks around the door. The fire burned low, and I kept adding wood to keep it alive. I stayed awake until my eyes ached, watching the darkness. Suddenly, I heard something hit the porch with a sharp thud. My heart jumped so hard I thought I might choke. I pointed the flashlight out the door and stepped carefully to the porch. The beam landed on a large rock, half covered in dirt and leaves, right where the thud had come from. I looked around but saw nothing else. No footprints nearby except my own. I locked the door again and went back inside, sitting as close to the fire as I could without burning myself. I thought about leaving, but it was still early in my trip. I wanted to give myself the chance to relax and enjoy the peace of the woods. I told myself it was probably just some animal knocking the rock loose or dropping it, maybe a raccoon or a bear looking for food. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The isolation that had felt peaceful now felt heavy and dangerous. I checked my phone again, still no signal. I was truly alone out here. The next day, I decided to explore a little further. I packed some water and food, dressed in layers, and headed into the woods. I kept to the paths I had marked and stayed aware of my surroundings. The forest was beautiful, alive with color and sound, but every now and then I'd stop, feeling the hairs on my neck stand up. There were more broken branches, disturbed leaves, and strange smells in the air, like something sharp and musky I couldn't identify. A few hours in, I found a clearing with an old, rusted pickup truck half covered in vines and leaves. It looked abandoned for years. Nearby, there was a small fire pit with blackened stones and burnt logs. Someone had clearly camped here recently, though the truck looked like it hadn't moved in a long time. I wondered who had been here and why. I noticed fresh footprints around the fire pit. They weren't animal prints, they looked like boots. The size was big, much bigger than mine. The prints headed deeper into the forest. My stomach tightened. I considered following them but decided against it. I didn't want to get lost or confront whoever had been here. I took a few pictures with my phone, hoping I could show someone later, and walked back to the cabin, feeling more nervous than before. That night, the noises returned with a new intensity. I heard voices far away, too quiet to understand but clearly human. There were footsteps around the cabin, slow and deliberate, circling, stopping and starting. The porch light flickered. Something heavy slammed against the door once, then twice. My hands shook as I locked every possible lock, moved the furniture in front of the door, and prepared to defend myself with a heavy stick I found outside. I stayed awake all night, watching, listening. The noises stopped before dawn, but the fear stayed. On the last day, I packed my things quickly, not wanting to spend another night in the cabin. I wanted to leave early, before dark. I double-checked every corner of the cabin for anything unusual. Nothing. The fire was out, the place silent. As I was about to leave, I saw fresh footprints in the dirt again. Right at the edge of the clearing, large boot prints heading away into the... The sun was sinking behind the thick pine forest as I pulled off the narrow dirt road and onto the uneven gravel path that led to the cabin. The place had been mine to use for the past few years, inherited from an uncle I barely knew. It was old, wooden, and isolated. Exactly what I needed to get away from the noise of the city and the weight of everyday life. I'd spent countless hours imagining what it would be like to be out here alone, breathing in the cold mountain air, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. Now I was finally here. The first thing that hit me was the smell. A mix of damp wood, moss, and the faint scent of smoke from last autumn's fire still clinging to the chimney. I grabbed my backpack, feeling the weight of supplies I'd packed for the weekend, and walked up to the cabin's front porch. The wood creaked under my boots, old but solid. I pushed open the heavy door, the rusty hinges protesting before giving way. Inside, the cabin was simple. A small stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a rough wooden mantel above it where old tools and bits of metal were scattered. The floorboards were worn and uneven. Dust lay thick in the corners and on the shelves, but the air was clean and smelled faintly of pine. The windows looked out onto the forest, the last streaks of light filtering through the tall trees. I dropped my bag by the door and started unpacking, lighting a small oil lamp to chase away the gathering shadows. I had brought canned food, fresh water from the stream nearby, a small camping stove, and plenty of firewood. Tonight, I planned to eat simply and then just sit by the fire, watch the flames dance, and listen to the night sounds. The first evening passed slowly, the quiet wrapping around me like a blanket. Birds had long since settled, and the only noises were the occasional crackle from the fire and the whisper of the wind through the branches outside. The temperature dropped quickly after sunset. I wrapped myself in a thick wool blanket and settled in a wooden chair, staring into the fire's glow. I thought the solitude would bring peace, but instead, the silence felt heavier than I expected. There was a kind of waiting in the air, like the forest itself was holding its breath. It was the kind of quiet that made your skin prick and your thoughts jump. I told myself to relax, that I was safe, and that it was just the unfamiliar stillness playing tricks on me. Sleep was uneasy. The bed was an old cot with a thin mattress, and the cold seeped through the cracks in the walls. Outside, I heard twigs snap and the rustle of leaves, but I tried not to think too much about what might be out there. The forest was alive with small animals moving in the dark, but the sounds took on a sharper edge in my mind. The next day, I woke early, rubbing the chill from my hands. The sky was clear and bright blue. I went outside to gather firewood, my boots sinking slightly in the soft earth. The trees stood tall and close, their trunks rough and dark with age. Moss and ferns carpeted the ground, damp and cool. I moved carefully, noticing how different the forest looked in daylight. Less intimidating, but still thick and vast. I spent the morning chopping wood, stacking it neatly near the cabin's back door. The work was hard but satisfying. Sweat dripped down my forehead, mixing with the fresh pine scent that filled the air. I moved to collect water from the stream, a cold, fast-running thread of clear mountain water that tumbled over smooth rocks. The water tasted crisp and pure, and I felt a little more grounded with every sip. As afternoon settled, I explored the area around the cabin. There was a faint trail that led into the deeper woods, overgrown in parts but still visible. I followed it for about half an hour, listening to the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant calls of birds. The forest was dense here, sunlight filtering in thin beams. I spotted small tracks in the mud, probably deer or rabbits, but no signs of people. Returning to the cabin, I started a fire in the hearth and prepared a simple meal. The food tasted better than anything I'd eaten in weeks. The fire's warmth was comforting, and the light pushed back the shadows gathering outside. I settled in again to read a book I'd brought along, but my attention kept drifting to the window. The forest looked different as dusk fell. The shapes of the trees became stark black silhouettes against the fading light. The air grew cooler and heavier, and the sounds of the forest shifted, the daytime birdsong replaced by the subtle movements of creatures waking for the night. I tried to shake the unease that was creeping in. There was nothing out there, just woods and animals. I reminded myself that the cabin had stood for decades without trouble. Still, every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my heart beat faster. Later, as the fire burned low, I thought I heard something outside, a soft thud, like a branch falling. I froze, listening. The wind had picked up, whistling through the trees, and the noise could have been anything. I told myself to relax, but my eyes kept darting toward the window. I checked the locks on the doors and windows just to be sure. That night, sleep came in fits. I woke several times, hearing sounds that seemed louder in the darkness. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside the cabin, slow and deliberate. I held my breath and stayed perfectly still, the the silence pressing in on me until the noises faded away. Morning brought relief. The sun rose slowly, filtering gold light through the trees. I took a deep breath, trying to shake the memory of the night's sounds. I packed a small bag and decided to hike further down the trail to clear my head. The woods were alive in the morning light. Birds chirped, squirrels darted through the underbrush, and the air was fresh with the smell of pine and earth. I followed the trail, which twisted and climbed, opening now and then to clearings filled with wildflowers and patches of moss. After about an hour, I reached an old, abandoned cabin, smaller and more run-down than mine. The roof sagged, and the windows were broken. It looked like no one had been there for years. I felt a shiver, not from cold but from the sense of loneliness that clung to the place. The door hung loosely on its hinges, creaking softly in the breeze. I didn't stay long. Something about the place felt wrong, like it had a story it wasn't willing to tell. I turned back to my cabin, the quiet forest closing in around me again. Back at the cabin, I spent the afternoon fixing the latch on the door and stacking more wood. The sky darkened early, heavy clouds rolling in. A storm was coming. I made sure everything was secure, that my lamp had enough oil, and that I had dry wood ready for the fire. The storm hit with a sudden roar. Rain hammered the roof, wind howled through the trees, and thunder rolled across the hills. I sat close to the fireplace, watching the flames flicker as lightning lit the cabin in bursts of white. The storm's power was terrifying and beautiful all at once. As the night deepened, I heard something again. Not outside this time, but inside the cabin. A subtle noise, maybe the creak of the old wood settling, or the wind pushing through a loose shutter. But it was different, closer. I strained to listen, my skin prickling. Suddenly, the lamp flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for matches, my hands shaking. When the light finally came back, I noticed the back door was slightly ajar, despite having locked it earlier. My heart pounded. I stood up slowly and closed the door firmly, checking the lock again. How had it opened? The storm was too fierce for anyone to have come here unnoticed. I told myself it was the wind. Maybe the old latch wasn't strong enough. But the feeling of being watched lingered. I stayed up the rest of the night, fire blazing, every sound making me jump. The storm finally passed by dawn, leaving the forest dripping and fresh. Exhausted, I collapsed on the cot, sleep taking me quickly. When I woke, the sun was shining again. The storm had cleared the air, and the forest felt peaceful once more. I stepped outside and saw that the storm had knocked down some branches near the cabin but hadn't done any serious damage. I decided it was time to leave. The woods were beautiful and quiet in the daylight, but the nights had been too unsettling. I packed my things slowly, careful not to rush, taking in the last of the pine scent and the clear mountain air. Before I left, I took one last walk around the property. I noticed fresh footprints in the mud near the cabin, human footprints. They were too large to be any animal and looked recent. My stomach tightened. Whoever had been here during the storm had come very close. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but I knew I didn't want to stay to find out. The cabin was a refuge in many ways, but it was also a place that tested my nerves and made me feel small and vulnerable. Driving away, I glanced back at the trees, the cabin almost swallowed by the forest. I knew I'd remember this trip for a long time, not because of some scary ghost story or legend, but because of the raw, quiet power of nature and the way it can unsettle you when you least expect it. There was no magic here, just the woods, the storm, and something or someone moved. The air smelled of damp pine needles and earth as I stepped out of my car. The gravel crunching under my boots was the only sound breaking the stillness of the early morning forest. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a pale orange glow between the tall, thick trunks of the trees. I looked up and could see only a patch of sky through the dense canopy above. I had been driving all night to get away from the noise and chaos of the city, craving silence and solitude. This cabin, tucked deep in the woods, was exactly the kind of place I needed. The path to the cabin was narrow and overgrown. The the bushes brushing against my legs as I carried my bags. I could hear birds waking up somewhere nearby, sparrows maybe. A squirrel darted past, disappearing into a tangle of branches. After about 10 minutes, I saw it. The cabin was small, built from rough-hewn logs, weathered by years of rain and sun. The roof sagged slightly, covered in dark moss. The windows were dusty, but the door looked sturdy and solid, with a heavy iron latch. I set my bags down and took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs. The smell of the forest was thick here. Wet earth, pine sap, the faint hint of smoke from a nearby campfire, though I wasn't sure if it was recent or just leftover from last season. I pushed open the door, which creaked on rusty hinges. Inside, the cabin was dim and smelled like old wood and dust. The floorboards were uneven and had gaps between them, creaking softly under my feet. There was a small table pushed against one wall, covered with a faded checkered cloth. An old cast-iron stove sat in the corner, blackened with soot. A few mismatched chairs were scattered around, and a small shelf held a few canned goods and a jar of pickles. The walls were bare except for some old photographs pinned up with rusty nails. They showed the cabin in its better days, surrounded by people who looked like they had spent their summers there decades ago. I put down my bags and opened the windows to let the fresh air in. The glass rattled slightly in the wooden frames. Outside, the forest seemed endless, thick trunks and underbrush that stretched as far as the eye could see. I could see a narrow dirt trail leading away from the cabin, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. It was silent except for the occasional bird call and the rustling of leaves in the morning breeze. I unpacked slowly, taking my time to arrange my things. I had brought food, water, a lantern, a blanket, and some books. No phone service here, no internet, just me and the woods. The idea of being cut off was part of the appeal, a chance to disconnect completely and find some peace. As the morning passed, I walked around the small clearing where the cabin stood. The grass was damp with dew, and tiny wildflowers peeked through. I noticed some animal tracks in the soft dirt near the edge of the trees, probably deer or maybe a fox. A few broken branches lay scattered around, and I wondered how recent they were. The forest was alive, but quiet. There was no wind to speak of, just a soft stillness that settled over everything. I gathered some dry wood from the pile near the cabin and started a small fire in the stove. The smoke curled up the chimney in thin wisps, and the warmth filled the room. I boiled water for tea, the kettle's whistle echoing in the small space. Sitting by the stove, I watched the flames dance behind the metal door, feeling a strange mix of comfort and unease. The sun climbed higher, and the light through the windows grew brighter. I decided to explore the trail. I pulled on my boots and grabbed my backpack, filling it with some snacks and a flashlight. The trail was narrow and winding, the ground soft underfoot. Branches brushed against my arms as I moved deeper into the woods. The trees were old, tall, and close together, their bark rough and cracked. The farther I went, the more isolated I felt. The trail twisted and turned, sometimes disappearing under fallen leaves or branches. I found a small creek, the water clear and cold as it trickled over smooth stones. I knelt down and cupped my hands to drink. The sound of the creek was soothing, breaking the silence with its gentle babble. As I walked back toward the cabin, I noticed something strange. The trail behind me looked disturbed, like someone had been there recently. The leaves were crushed and scattered, and there were footprints, too large for any animal. I stopped and looked closer. The prints were irregular, the shape unclear, but definitely human. That made me pause. Who else could be here in such a remote place? I quickened my pace, feeling a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. When I got back to the cabin, I checked all the windows and doors. Everything was as I had left it. I told myself it was probably a hunter or someone else passing through, but the thought didn't settle well in my mind. That evening, I built a fire outside, in a small stone ring just off the porch. The flames crackled and spat, casting long shadows that danced across the trees. The sky darkened quickly, the stars coming out one by one. The forest around me seemed to hold its breath in the dark. I sat close to the fire, the heat comforting against the cool night air. The sounds of the forest changed. Crickets chirped, and somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. The wind picked up slightly, making the branches creak and groan. I kept my eyes on the edge of the clearing, where the trees met the open sky. Suddenly, I heard something, footsteps, crunching leaves and snapping twigs. It wasn't close, but it was definitely moving toward the cabin. My heart jumped. I stared into the dark woods, trying to see, but all I could make out were shadows shifting in the firelight. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then, something shifted in the bushes near the trail. I grabbed my flashlight and swung it toward the movement. The beam caught a glimpse of a figure, tall, wearing dark clothes, standing just beyond the trees. I froze. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there watching. The hairs on my arms stood up. I wanted to run, but I was rooted in place. After what felt like an eternity, the figure turned and disappeared into the forest. I didn't wait to see where. I grabbed my things and locked myself inside the cabin. I checked the locks twice and sat by the stove, the fire burning low. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside, made me jump. I kept the lantern close, its soft light filling the small room. The night passed slowly, the forest outside silent once more. In the morning, I decided I couldn't stay. Whatever that figure was, I didn't want to find out. I packed my things quickly, my hands trembling. Before I left, I walked around the clearing once more. I found footprints in the dirt, large, heavy, and too deep to be from any animal. They circled the cabin, coming close but never quite reaching the door. I felt exposed, like the cabin had been watched for days. But now I was ready to go. I drove away slowly, the gravel crunching under my tires again. The forest behind me swallowed the cabin and the trail, the trees standing silent guard. I didn't look back until the cabin was a small speck in the rearview mirror. Driving back to the city, I thought about what had happened. The woods were beautiful but unpredictable, full of life and hidden things. The peace I had sought was real, but so was the danger. I promised myself I would come back someday, better prepared, but for now I was just glad to be away. The cabin would stay there, waiting, silent and still, deep in the forest, holding its secrets under the watchful trees. The wind pushed hard against the trees outside the cabin, rattling the thin wooden shutters on the windows. I sat on the edge of the small bed, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in on me. The only sound was the creak of the old wooden floorboards beneath my feet and the occasional thump of a branch tapping the roof. I had come to this cabin alone, deep in the woods, to escape everything. The noise of the city, the constant pressure of work, and the people who always expected something from me. I wanted quiet, peace, and time to think. But what I found was something else entirely. The cabin itself was a rough structure, built decades ago, its logs darkened by rain and time. The front porch sagged slightly to one side, and the rusty hinges of the door groaned when I opened it. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and old smoke. A small fireplace sat against the far wall, its chimney still clogged with soot. The furniture was sparse. A rickety table, 2 chairs, the bed, and a cracked wooden cupboard with a few old pots and pans. There was no electricity or running water, which was part of the appeal for me. I had packed everything I needed. A few cans of food, a lantern with extra batteries, water bottles, a thick sleeping bag, and a small first aid kit. The rest I thought I could manage without. That first evening, after unpacking my bag, I started a small fire in the fireplace. The dry wood crackled and sparked, filling the room with a soft glow and the warm smell of burning pine. Outside, the sun had dipped below the tree line, and the shadows stretched long across the forest floor. The woods felt dense and alive, but also silent in a way that made me uncomfortable. I knew the forest could be dangerous, wild animals, unstable terrain, or even just getting lost in the dark. But I told myself I was prepared. I had a map, a compass, and a basic knowledge of survival skills from hiking trips years ago. As night fell fully, the temperature dropped sharply. I wrapped myself tightly in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds outside. The wind moaned through the branches, and somewhere far off, an owl hooted. The cabin creaked as it settled, making me jump a little each time. It was a strange feeling, being so isolated. My phone had no signal, and there were no other cabins or signs of life nearby. For a moment, I felt a flicker of fear, not of ghosts or anything supernatural, but a raw, human fear of being alone in a place where help would not come easily. I tried to sleep, but found it difficult. Every noise seemed amplified. The rustling of leaves sounded like footsteps. The snapping of twigs felt like someone moving closer. I reminded myself to stay calm, to rationalize each sound. Still, the unease gnawed at me through the long night. Morning came slow and gray. I brewed some coffee on a small camp stove outside and ate a simple breakfast of canned beans warmed over the flame. The forest around me looked different in daylight, less threatening but no less vast. I decided to explore a little, wanting to stretch my legs and get a sense of my surroundings. The trees were thick, mostly pine and birch, with patches of moss and ferns covering the ground. The soil was damp, and small streams trickled between rocks. As I walked, I noticed signs of animals. Tracks in the mud, chewed leaves, and the occasional broken branch. I even caught sight of a deer bounding away into the brush. The forest was full of life, but life that paid no attention to me. After a few hours, I returned to the cabin, feeling tired but oddly refreshed. The isolation was both a balm and a burden. I wanted to disconnect but not to feel cut off. I spent the afternoon cleaning the cabin, stacking firewood, and fixing the door latch that had loosened. I found an old manual tucked in a drawer, full of notes about the cabin's history. Apparently, it had been built by a man who used to work the nearby land decades ago. The forest had since grown back around it, swallowing the trails and fields once cleared for farming. It gave the place a sense of age, of being forgotten. That night, I was more prepared. I set extra logs in the fireplace and kept the lantern close. I stayed awake longer, reading the manual and watching the fire flicker. The wind had calmed somewhat, but the forest still felt alive outside. Then I heard it, a faint sound, almost like scratching or scraping. It was coming from outside, near the back of the cabin. I froze, listening carefully. The sound stopped after a moment, but my heart raced. I forced myself to stand and grab the flashlight. Moving quietly, I stepped out the back door. The air was cold, and the moon was hidden behind thick clouds. I scanned the trees and underbrush with the beam. Nothing moved, nothing shone back. I checked the perimeter of the cabin, shining the light over the ground and the low bushes. No signs of animals or anything unusual. Still, the noise had come from somewhere. Maybe a branch rubbing against the siding, or an animal brushing past. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I closed the door and locked it, bolting the latch firmly. That night, I barely slept. The next day, I planned to stay inside as much as possible. I cooked some soup on the stove and spent time reading the manual and a small book I brought along about edible wild plants. I told myself that I was safe, that this was just the normal sounds of the forest, that my mind was playing tricks because of the isolation. In the afternoon, I went outside again to gather more firewood. The sky was clearer now, and the sun warmed my back. I walked toward a small clearing I had spotted earlier. It was a nice spot with flat rocks and a patch of grass perfect for sitting. While I was there, I noticed something odd. A set of footprints in the mud near the edge of the clearing. They looked fresh and larger than mine. The prints were uneven, as if whoever made them had been limping slightly. My heart jumped again. I knew this forest wasn't a popular spot for visitors, but someone had been close. I followed the tracks slowly, careful not to lose them. They led toward a narrow path disappearing into thicker brush. I thought about turning back, but curiosity pushed me forward. After about 10 minutes, the tracks faded. I scanned the area, looking for any sign of a campsite or discarded trash, something that would explain the footprints. Instead, I found a small, crudely built shelter made of branches and leaves. It looked like someone had stayed here recently. There was a tattered backpack nearby and a few cans of food. My mind raced. Who was living out here? Was this person dangerous? Had they seen me? I decided to leave the area immediately and head back to the cabin. The rest of the day passed in a haze of unease. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows and kept the lantern close at hand. That night, I barely dared to step outside even for a moment. In the darkness, I heard more sounds, soft footsteps around the cabin, rustling in the undergrowth, faint voices carried on the wind that I couldn't make out. I felt trapped, watching the windows with every flicker of the firelight. Hours passed like this, tension building until exhaustion finally took me. The following morning, I found footprints right outside the front door. They were too large to be mine and they looked recent. My first instinct was to pack up and leave immediately. But the dirt road leading back to civilization was miles away through dense forest. I didn't have a car here, only my hiking boots and my small pack. I had to be smart. I spent the day carefully watching the area around the cabin. I set up a simple alarm, strings tied to cans placed strategically near the perimeter, hoping to catch any intruder's approach. But no one came close. The footprints had vanished. Still, I felt eyes on me constantly. I stayed inside more, keeping the fire going and the lantern ready. I checked my supplies and rationed food carefully, knowing I might need to stay longer than planned if the situation worsened. On the third night, the wind rose again, stronger than before. It shook the cabin and made the windows bang like thunder. I heard heavy footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. Then, faint knocking on the door. My stomach clenched. I stayed silent, waiting. The knocking stopped. Then a voice whispered something too low to understand. My heart pounded. I grabbed the largest piece of firewood I could find and moved to the door. The knocking resumed, more urgent. I shouted loudly to scare whoever it was away, pounding on the door from inside. The footsteps retreated quickly into the forest. The rest of the night was restless. I kept a fire burning high and sat in the darkest corner, gripping the firewood tightly. The isolation I sought had become a trap of fear. When dawn finally broke, pale and weak through the fog, I made a decision. I could not stay here any longer. I packed my things fast, took a deep breath, and headed out on the trail. The forest was thick, but I kept the path in sight and moved steadily. The hike back was long and exhausting. I stumbled over roots, waded through mud, and pushed through thorny bushes. The sun climbed higher, warming my back. I kept thinking about the cabin. The sun had just dipped below the horizon when I pulled off the main road, turning onto the narrow dirt path that led to the cabin. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, the kind of scent that clings to your clothes after a long walk in the woods. My truck rattled along the uneven trail, kicking up dust that settled back down almost immediately in the stillness of the evening. I could see the cabin now, a small wooden structure tucked into the trees, its dark windows reflecting the last bit of fading light. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. The city was exhausting me, with its noise and constant rush, and I needed a break. The cabin was supposed to be the perfect place to get away, to unplug and relax for a few days alone. No distractions, no people, just the quiet of the forest and the crackle of a fire at night. I parked the truck in the small clearing and stepped out, stretching my legs after the long drive. The forest around me was dense, with tall fir trees that blocked out most of the remaining daylight. The cabin looked a little older than I expected, weathered wood and a sagging roof, but it had a solid feel to it. The porch creaked under my weight as I walked up the steps, the smell of old wood and smoke hitting me as I opened the front door. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. A small kitchen with a wood stove, a table, a couple of chairs, and a rough-hewn bed in the corner. Dust covered the surfaces, and cobwebs hung in the corners, but it felt like a place that had been loved once. I dropped my bag on the floor and opened the windows to let in the fresh air. The forest seemed to press close to the cabin, dark and quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves. I unpacked my things slowly, lighting a few candles to chase away the shadows inside. There was no electricity here, no phone signal, just the forest and the cabin and me. I was alone. Night fell quickly, The sky outside was a deep velvet black, dotted with stars brighter than I had seen in years. I built a fire in the stone hearth and sat close to it, the warmth easing the chill that had settled in the cabin. The silence was something I wasn't used to. It pressed in on me from all sides. I listened to the crackle of the fire and the distant calls of owls. I could hear the wind moving through the trees, making the branches scrape against the cabin walls like nails on a chalkboard. After a while, I settled into bed, the heavy quilt pulled up to my chin. The wooden floor creaked beneath me as I shifted. Outside, the forest was alive in a way that felt both calming and strange. I stared at the ceiling, my mind wandering. At some point in the night, I was woken by a noise, a faint scraping sound, like something dragging against wood. My heart started to beat faster. I told myself it was just the wind or a branch brushing the cabin, but the sound repeated, slow and steady, came from outside the door. I lay still, holding my breath. The scraping stopped. Then came a low thud, like something heavy dropping on the ground. My eyes adjusted to the dark, but the shadows in the room didn't move. I reached over and grabbed my flashlight from the nightstand. The beam cut through the dark like a knife as I crept toward the door. Outside, the forest was black, but I could see the outline of something near the porch. A fallen branch maybe, or a pile of leaves moved by the wind. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin, and scanned the clearing. Nothing. The quiet stretched out, heavy and oppressive. I decided it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but the thought didn't settle well with me. Something about the way the sounds had come, deliberate and slow, didn't fit with an animal's usual nervous scurry. I shook the feeling off and went back inside, locking the door behind me. The next day, I woke early and made coffee on the stove. The sunlight poured in through the windows, making the dust motes dance in the air. I moved around the cabin, opening drawers and cupboards, looking for supplies. There were a few cans of food left behind, beans, soup, some old crackers. Not enough for a long stay, but enough for a couple of days. I decided to explore the area around the cabin, hoping the fresh air and exercise would clear my head. The forest was thick with underbrush, the ground soft with fallen needles. I followed a narrow trail that led downhill toward a small creek. The water was clear and cold, tumbling over smooth rocks. I knelt to drink, the coolness refreshing after the hike. As I wandered, I noticed signs of animals. Tracks in the mud, claw marks on tree trunks, feathers caught in the branches. The forest was alive with movement, though most of it was hidden from view. I felt a thrill of excitement. This was the kind of place where you could disappear from the world, at least for a little while. Returning to the cabin, I decided to clean up a bit. Sweeping the floor made the place feel less abandoned. I stacked some firewood by the hearth and checked the stove to make sure it was safe. The afternoon sun made the cabin warm, and I felt sleepy. I stretched out on the bed, the mattress firm but comfortable. For a while, I let myself drift off, the sounds of the forest lulling me. That night, I heard the noises again. The scraping at the door, slow and steady, followed by the thud outside. This time, I grabbed my flashlight and a heavy stick I found by the porch before going outside. The air was colder now, and a fog was starting to roll in, blurring the edges of the trees. I circled the cabin, shining the light into the shadows. Nothing stirred except the occasional flutter of a bird or the skitter of a mouse. But then, near the back, I saw it. A footprint in the mud, fresh and deep. It was larger than mine, with a rough tread pattern like the sole of a boot. My heart pounded. Someone had been here. Someone had come close enough to leave footprints. I checked the perimeter, but found no other signs. No broken branches, no disturbed bushes. Whoever it was, they had been careful. The thought of a stranger lurking around the cabin made the hairs on my neck stand up. I didn't sleep well after that. Every sound seemed louder, every shadow deeper. The following day, I stayed inside most of the time, keeping the door locked and windows shut. I didn't want to wander far, not knowing if someone was watching. I made more firewood and prepared a simple meal on the stove. In the afternoon, I noticed something new. A small bundle of sticks tied together and left on the porch. It wasn't there before. I didn't recognize the arrangement, but it looked deliberate, like a marker or a message. The sticks were tied with bits of string, frayed and dirty. I picked it up carefully, turning it over in my hands. There was no note, no sign of who had left it. Just the bundle. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. I realized that whoever had been outside the cabin was trying to communicate or mark their presence. I felt exposed, vulnerable. That night, I prepared differently. I placed the heaviest furniture I could move against the door and kept the stick nearby. I didn't want to be caught off guard. The noises came again, the scraping, the thud. This time, I shouted and banged on the door, hoping to scare whoever was outside. The noises stopped. I stayed awake for hours, flashlight in hand, watching the windows. When dawn finally arrived, the forest seemed peaceful again. The last day was tense. I packed my things quickly, eager to leave. As I loaded the truck, I noticed something written faintly in the dirt near the porch. A word, or maybe a name. It was hard to make out, but it looked like leave. My hands trembled as I got in the truck and started the engine. The dirt road felt narrow and endless as I drove away, glancing back at the cabin disappearing into the trees. I never saw anyone or anything, no proof of who had been there or why, but I knew the forest wasn't empty. Someone had been watching, waiting, sending a warning. I wasn't sure if it was out of anger, fear, or something else entirely. The cabin was supposed to be a place of peace, but it wasn't. It was a place where the quiet hides more than just trees and animals. And sometimes, it's better to listen to the warning and leave before the silence breaks. I never planned to spend the night alone in a cabin deep in the woods, but life has a strange way of pushing you into situations you never imagined. I needed the quiet, a place far from the city and its noise. I needed to clear my head after a rough few months. So when I found the cabin for rent online, a small wooden place surrounded by miles of forest, I thought it would be perfect. The pictures showed a modest cabin with a porch, a wood stove, and no electricity, no distractions. Just nature and silence. It sounded like the peace I wanted. The drive out was long. The narrow dirt roads wound through dense trees, tall pines and oaks shading the path. At times, the forest seemed to press close on either side, thick and dark. I passed no other cars, no houses, only occasional signs warning about wildlife and rough terrain. My phone's signal dropped as I got further away from town, but I didn't mind. The world was shrinking down to just me and the woods. When I arrived, the cabin was exactly as promised, old but sturdy. The wood was weathered, stained a dull brown from years of rain and sun. Moss grew on the roof and the chimney leaned slightly. Around it, the forest pressed in tight, trees and bushes close to the porch. A small clearing let in sunlight during the day, but by evening, shadows swallowed the cabin. No lights except the faint glow of the setting sun filtered through the trees. I unlocked the door with the key left for me and stepped inside. The cabin smelled of dry wood, earth, and a faint hint of something old, like dust and time. The air was cool but stale, like it hadn't been opened for a while. Inside was simple. A small kitchen area with a sink, a counter, and some shelves lined with canned goods and basic supplies. A worn wooden table sat near a window looking out into the forest. A wood stove stood in the corner, and a narrow staircase led up to a loft where the bed was. I set my bags down and took in the quiet. No hum of electricity, no sound of cars or people, just the soft rustling of leaves outside. I went outside to gather some firewood for the stove. The woodpile was stacked neatly by the side of the cabin, logs split and dry. The forest floor was soft with fallen leaves and pine needles, and the smell of damp earth filled the air. I built a fire in the stove, the dry wood crackling as it caught flame. The warmth filled the room quickly, and I felt a little safer with the heat and light. Darkness crept in fast, swallowing the clearing and turning the trees into tall, black shapes. The wind picked up, whispering through the branches, sending a chill through the cabin. I settled in with a book but found I couldn't concentrate. My mind kept drifting to the woods outside. The night grew darker, deeper. Outside, The forest was alive with sounds. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the distant call of an owl. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just animals moving around. But after a while, the noises seemed too close, too deliberate. Something was out there. I stood up and walked to the window. The glass was cold against my skin. I peered into the darkness but could see nothing beyond the faint outline of trees. The wind shifted and brought a new sound. A low, dragging noise, like something heavy moving over dry branches and stones. My heart rate sped up. I strained to listen, but the forest swallowed the sound quickly. I told myself I was imagining things. I had been alone in the woods before, and animals made plenty of noise at night. Maybe a deer or a raccoon scavenging. I tried to go back to my book, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. Every few minutes, I caught a glimpse of movement outside, just at the edge of the clearing. Shadows shifting, something not quite right. Later, I heard footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate, on the path leading to the cabin. They stopped just outside the door. My breath caught. The wind died down. The forest went silent. For a moment, I thought I was frozen in time, my heart pounding so loud I was sure it would give me away. The footsteps moved away slowly, crunching over leaves and twigs, fading into the dark. I sat down again, trying to calm myself. The fire was almost out, and the cabin was cold again. I gathered more wood and added it to the stove, watching the flames dance. Outside, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Sleep came slowly, uneasy and light. Every sound outside jolted me awake. Branches tapping the windows, the creak of old wood settling. When morning finally arrived, the sky was gray and heavy with clouds. I stepped outside, the cold air sharp in my lungs. The forest was quiet now, peaceful, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I decided to take a walk around the cabin, hoping to clear my head and maybe find some clues about what I heard last night. The forest was thick and tangled, the ground uneven with roots and rocks. I noticed footprints in the soft earth near the path, large, heavy, and irregular, not like a deer or a common animal. Human footprints, but they didn't match any shoes I owned or anything I'd seen on the road. My skin prickled. Someone had been near the cabin, maybe last night, maybe someone was still around. I followed the tracks cautiously, deeper into the trees, careful not to make noise. The footprints led to a small clearing where I found an old campsite, long abandoned. A rusted fire pit, broken bottles scattered on the ground, and scraps of torn cloth caught in the bushes. Signs someone had been living rough here at some point. I didn't stay long. The forest was too silent, too still. I headed back, deciding to lock all the doors and windows tight and stay inside for the rest of the day. I packed my things, thinking maybe I would leave early in the morning. But the sun disappeared behind thick clouds, and rain started to fall slow, steady, soaking through the thin roof. That night was worse than the first. The rain hammered on the roof like thunder, and the wind howled through the trees. The cabin groaned and creaked under the storm. Outside, the forest became a dark, wet maze of shadows and sounds. Every noise was sharper in the rain. Branches snapping, water dripping, the scurry of unseen animals. Then, in the middle of the night, the door shook. At first, just a slight rattling, like the wind pushing against it. But then something heavier hit it, again and again. Hard knocks, solid and threatening. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I moved to the door, ready to check it, but something told me not to open it. The knocking stopped. Silence fell again, heavy and complete. Then, faint but unmistakable, I heard breathing. Slow, labored breaths right outside the door. Someone was out there. Not the wind, not an animal. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door just a crack. The porch was empty. The rain had washed away any footprints. No one was there. I scanned the trees beyond but saw nothing but darkness and wet leaves. I closed the door and locked it again, heart racing. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching a heavy stick I found outside, ready to defend myself. The rain slowed, then stopped. Morning came cold and gray, and I was exhausted. I knew I couldn't stay. This cabin, this forest, held something dangerous, something I couldn't face alone. I packed quickly and left the cabin, locking the door behind me. As I walked down the muddy path to the main road, I glanced back once. In the distance, just beyond the tree line, I saw a figure standing still, watching me, tall, hunched, motionless. I stopped, heart pounding, but when I blinked, it was gone. The drive back was long and tense. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure following. But I never did. Back in town, the noise and people felt overwhelming but safe. I reported what I saw to the local ranger station, but they said the area was known for hikers and hunters, some of whom were rough around the edges. They couldn't promise anything but told me to avoid staying out there alone. That cabin was meant to be a refuge. Instead, it became a place I wouldn't ever forget. A reminder that the wilderness holds its own dangers, and sometimes the scariest things are the people who choose to live there, unseen and watching. I've never gone back. I don't want to know what that figure was, or if it's still out there. Some places are better left alone, and some nights are best spent in the light of the city, where the shadows stay distant and the threats are fewer. The sun was already low in the sky when I pulled off the narrow dirt road and onto the gravel driveway leading to the cabin. The place looked just like I remembered from the pictures online. A small, weathered wooden building tucked away in the dense woods, surrounded by tall pine trees that swayed gently in the evening breeze. The paint on the cabin's exterior was faded and peeling, but it gave the place a rustic charm. I parked my car and stepped out, the cool air filling my lungs with a mix of pine and damp earth. The silence was almost overwhelming. No cars, no voices, just the occasional creak of tree branches and the distant call of a bird. I wasn't sure why I had decided to spend a few days here alone. Maybe it was the need to get away from the city noise, the constant rush of people, or just the desire to find some quiet to think. I'd rented this cabin online, a modest place with basic amenities. No internet, no cell reception, just electricity and running water. Perfect for disconnecting. As I approached the front door, I noticed the lock was old and rusty. I fumbled with the key, finally turning it and pushing the door open. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and dust, mixed with a faint hint of dampness. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and a thin layer of dust covered the furniture. It was simple, a small kitchen with a stove and a fridge, a dining table with 2 chairs, and a living area with a worn-out couch and a couple of armchairs. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom and a small bathroom. I dropped my bags on the floor and pulled open the windows to let fresh air in. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees and turning the sky shades of orange and pink. The forest was thick around the cabin, dense enough that you couldn't see more than a few yards in any direction. I liked that. Felt like a real escape. That first night, I sat on the porch, a small fire crackling in the stone pit. The stars were bright and countless, the kind of sky you only see far away from city lights. I kept a few logs nearby and a flashlight just in case. The forest was alive with sounds, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, the occasional snap of a twig. It all felt natural, part of the wilderness, but also a little unsettling when the dark grew thick. I went inside early, not wanting to stay out too late on my first night. The cabin was chilly without heat, but I had packed warm clothes and a heavy blanket. The bed creaked when I lay down, and the silence inside felt heavier than outside. I didn't sleep well, waking several times to strange noises. A soft thump here, a scratching there, that I told myself were just animals moving around. The cabin was old. I expected it to make noises. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the curtains. The air was crisp, and I brewed coffee on the stove while listening to the forest wake up. Birds chirped, and somewhere nearby, a woodpecker hammered against a tree trunk. I planned to spend the day hiking on the trails marked on the map the rental owner had left me. The woods were supposed to have some nice views, a small lake, and an old logging path that hadn't been used for decades. After a simple breakfast of eggs and toast, I packed a backpack with water, snacks, a map, compass, and my camera. The trail started just a few hundred yards from the cabin, disappearing into thick bushes and tall trees. The air smelled clean, fresh, a stark contrast to the city's exhaust and concrete. The hike was peaceful at first. The path was narrow and winding, with fallen leaves crunching beneath my boots. Every now and then, the trees opened up to reveal a small clearing, dappled in sunlight. I paused often, taking pictures of wildflowers, moss-covered rocks, and the occasional squirrel darting among the branches. About 2 hours in, I reached the lake. It was small but beautiful, a quiet pool of water surrounded by fir trees and scattered boulders. The surface was smooth and reflected the blue sky. I sat on a rock near the edge, dipping my fingers into the cold water. It was the kind of place that made you forget time. No noise except for the gentle rustle of wind and the distant call of birds. After resting for a bit, I decided to explore the old logging path. It was marked on the map as an abandoned trail, rarely used. The path was overgrown, with fallen branches and thick underbrush making progress slow. I pushed through the weeds, feeling the dampness of the forest floor underfoot. The air was cooler here, shaded by the dense canopy. As I walked, I started noticing signs that something had passed this way recently. Broken branches, flattened grass. Not human footprints exactly, but something larger. I told myself it was probably deer or another animal. The forest was full of them. The sun began to lower again, and I realized I'd been out longer than I expected. The cabin was still a couple of miles away, and the trail was twisting and confusing. I checked my compass and map, making sure I was heading in the right direction. But soon the path seemed to disappear altogether, swallowed by the forest. Panic started to creep in. I called out a few times, but only silence answered. My phone had no signal, just as promised. I tried to stay calm and retraced my steps, but the trees all looked the same, and the trail markers were faint or missing. After what felt like an hour of walking in circles, the sky had darkened to a deep blue. I knew I had to find shelter before it got completely dark. I spotted a fallen tree large enough to sit on and rested for a moment, breathing hard and trying to keep my mind steady. Suddenly, a noise made me freeze. It was a rustling sound, close and deliberate, unlike the usual forest sounds. I looked around, shining my flashlight, but saw nothing. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. The rustling moved to my left, then right, circling me. I gripped my flashlight tighter, heart pounding. It became clear whatever was out there was big, moving quietly but with purpose. The stories I had heard about bears or even mountain lions crossed my mind, but I had no bear spray or weapons, just my little backpack and flashlight. I decided to move slowly toward what I hoped was the right direction, the cabin. Every step was cautious, ears straining to catch any sound. The rustling stopped suddenly, as if whatever was out there was watching me. I quickened my pace, finally spotting the faint glow of the cabin's porch light. Relief washed over me like a wave. I ran the last few yards, pushing open the door and stepping inside. I locked it behind me and leaned against it, gasping for breath. Inside, the cabin felt safe but fragile. I checked the windows and locked them. The forest outside was pitch black, the trees mere shadows against the sky. The noises had stopped. For a while, all was quiet. I stayed awake most of the night, sitting by the small stove and staring out the window, flashlight at the ready. No more rustling came. The forest returned to its natural sounds, the occasional hoot of an owl, the wind moving through the pines. The next day, I explored a different trail closer to the cabin, sticking to well-marked paths and carrying my emergency whistle. The woods were less threatening in daylight. I realized how easy it was to get turned around when the trails weren't clear, how quickly the forest swallowed any sign of human presence. I spent the next couple of days in a rhythm, hiking, resting, reading, cooking simple meals. The cabin's solitude was peaceful, even comforting, once I got used to the sounds of the wild and the isolation. On the last morning, I packed my things slowly, savoring the last moments of quiet. As I locked the cabin door behind me and started walking toward my car, the sun rose higher, casting warm light on the forest floor. The dangers of the night felt distant now, like a shadow fading with the dawn. Driving away, I glanced back at the cabin, small and quiet among the trees. The woods had tested me, shown me their wild side, but I had come through it, alone, unarmed, but stronger for having faced the rawness of nature without illusions or stories. That trip wasn't about fear or escape from anything supernatural. It was about being real with myself, facing the quiet, the loneliness, the unpredictability of the world outside my usual life. And in that stillness, I found something clear. Strength isn't just about control. Sometimes it's about enduring the unknown and coming back whole.